Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers.
Welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. I'm Brett Johnson here early morning with John Kontz. John, welcome. Good to have you with me.
Good to see you, Brett.
Yep. So John is a serial entrepreneur. I got to know John and Ariel at Christian Economic Forum. I met John some years ago, 2022. Then we sat down with him and Ariel in Quebec a couple of years ago. And since then, we've been in touch on a regular basis. John has been part of our discipleship group. He's also just become a good friend and a wonderful guy. And we're talking about investing with Africa. We're into this new series. And so why have I got a guy from Pennsylvania or somewhere like that on the east coast of the US talking about Africa? John and Ariel have spent the last year in Kigali, and he's had quite a bit of exposure from a US perspective on what it looks like to try to invest in Africa. What does it look like? Due diligence, opportunities, culture, other things. So I'm pleased to hear from John today. John, welcome. Good to have you with me.
Thanks, Brett.
Yeah. So John, go back a bit on your story. You don't have to go all the way to how you wooed your wife in a dating challenge, but tell us a bit about your entrepreneurial journey and the kinds of things you've been involved in. You're an angel investor, you've run businesses, you've built businesses, you've sold businesses. Tell us a bit about your story.
Yeah, so my background is, I grew up in kind of rural, low-income Pennsylvania. In the area of Pennsylvania that's been affected significantly by the closure of coal mines and the shift away from that. Got into kind of the most basic types of industries you could, cutting lawns and delivering papers and things like that early on, and then started buying companies when I was in college and immediately after, and selling companies and buying and selling, and just really enjoyed the creativity side of transactions and how you can create a win-win for a lot of different people and reposition assets and communities and for communities. And then that led to doing turnarounds, and have done a couple of companies and a few different assets, and now focus on angel investing through the holding company that's owned by Ariel and I.
Yeah.
And that took us to Africa for a year to just learn and discover and ask questions and figure out how is capital allocation different in Africa than in the US. And so I think a focus has been building, repositioning, and kind of picking teams or picking markets. And so this was just kind of a further discovery, the intercontinental discovery along those lines.
Fantastic. Yeah. Now you and Ariel are intercontinental anyway, as back in your history. So Ariel's parents, they've got a US Holland or US Netherlands connection over there, and you spent some time in France. So this isn't your first foray outside of Pennsylvania, right?
Correct. Yes, he spent some time in Texas, and
that's another country. So there you go.
Might become its own continent soon. I don't know the way things are going, but Texas, France, have spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and so now Africa being on the list. We've also done a bit of work in China, and so that was really fun to be exposed to that market and a different way of thinking and working. Yeah.
Okay, before we jump into Africa, what was your favorite acquisition, sale, or turnaround? What did you enjoy the most out of the different ones you've done? Because it's pretty impressive starting to buy businesses when you're in college and you're not sitting with a trust fund behind you. I'm sure a lot of people have questions about, well, how did you do that? And maybe we need to talk about that sometime. But just tell me your favorite either turnaround or transaction you were involved in.
Yeah, my favorite was probably the hardest and the most brutal, which was buying into a luxury construction company
Mm,
in um, 2011. We did
yeah,
international custom homes, and the market for that had really softened. And traditional sales channels changed kind of all of a sudden. And so the business was really gasping for air, and we were able to come in and inject life into that. And um, yeah, that was really fascinating. I think the multi-dimensional beauty, like you're creating beautiful things in beautiful places, and at the same time creating an outsized um, opportunity financially for shareholders
yeah,
and vendors, giving people opportunities to work in ways that are really satisfying and enjoyable and challenging. Just
yeah.
the high performance atmosphere is super fun.
So were these houses in exotic locations, or where were they? You said they were overseas or international?
Yeah, Abuja, Nigeria.
Mhm.
We worked on a development in Qingdao, China, and Beijing. Um, and then obviously Southern California, New York, all
Mm.
that good stuff. So very fun.
Yeah, yeah, great. Fantastic. Well, I've been to all of those locations and some of them are quite challenging for sure. Yeah. I remember being in Abuja and because that city just popped up in the middle of the government, just the president at the time just chose the spot in the middle of the country where there were sort of three villages and decided to build a new city out there because Lagos was so congested. And then they were still busy building when there was an assassination attempt on his life, and he just said, okay, we're moving. And so the government moved before the city was really ready. And so it's great with its wider streets, a bit like Pretoria and things like that. But of course, then you had government ministers and others building homes in green belts and other things. And it was a bit of the Wild West out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, fun. Great. So, John, let's talk a bit about investing with Africa. You very kindly have read the book that's just come out recently. And as always, I know you've read other books that I've written, like the Inspired Innovation book, and given me lots of feedback. And one of the questions as an entrepreneur that you often ask me is, Brett, so what do you want people to do once they've read the book? Who is this for, etc. And you've got a breadth of experience in investing, and you notice some differences, which I've not asked you about yet. So this is a cold interview. I might be getting some bad news over here, but you've got some perspectives on how this differs from or provides an angle that some other things you've seen haven't done. So I'd love to explore those things with you. I think you said you had four or so points, and you'd like to cover those. So I'd love to hear overall impressions and then just the specific things that you had in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of what did I think about your book, it's um was a unique read for me because it's obviously about a lot of the things I'm thinking about, and so kind of a lot of top of mind stuff, but also I think it was a little bit different. Yeah, like you had mentioned the positioning. Now your positioning on how to invest in Africa brought in some new nuances of conversation, and so a couple of them. I don't know, do you want me to just go rapid fire down
Yeah,
through? Or,
sure. Yeah. And we can unpack them as we go. Yeah, sure. Go.
yeah,
Give us the
cool.
headlines and then we'll go back on them. How about that?
Sounds good. Yeah. So I think one of the positional shifts that you recommend is for investors to think of themselves as investing with Africa. And I
Mm,
think one of the interesting things about that, it might seem like, of course, you want to invest with people and not just in or for. But one of the interesting shifts there is that you're paying attention as an investor to things that Africans are investing in,
mm,
and to what degree they're investing in. And I think that's really important. That pacing piece often gets um, ignored.
mm.
Um, and the proportioning of Western investment to African investment. And um, if there's a reason Africans aren't investing in something, it might be a good reason why that is.
Yeah.
And if there are proportion issues, like we would be investing a lot more than Africans would be investing. We might ask
Yeah.
ourselves, like, hey, are we able to get returns if we're investing at this level?
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
the locals aren't doing that. And so I think that it's good sense as investing to ch make the change from for or in Africa to with Africa. But I think it also is a little bit of a more nuanced perspective. And I feel like a lot of people don't like the word nuance because it seems like you're trying to say something without saying anything. But I think it also can mean that, you're seeing deeper shades of quality
Mhm.
decision. And I think
Mhm.
they're um, when you get into very complex environments where there's a lot of horizontal agendas that might not be immediately obvious, moving slowly, decisively, and in kind of short bursts is usually a good idea.
Yeah.
And I think that investing with Africa, it tends to be how
Mhm.
how that works better.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, let's unpack that a bit because last week I had Dr. Oke Enalama on, and he's was the Minister of Trade and Investments in Nigeria, but he set up African Capital Alliance. He's the chairman, just about 30 years ago, 28 years ago, and got a lot of institutional money in, and I mean they've done big transactions, big deals, and so on. And the there are Africans who know how to invest in Africa. I mean, it's not like, here's a bunch of Americans or people from Europe and nobody in Africa has ever heard of venture capital or whatever. And one of the things that I looked at in the book in terms of research was how much the diaspora was putting in. And just yesterday, I was looking at how much money gets remitted around Africa. So for Nigerians from South Africa back to Nigeria or to Ghana or to Zimbabwe and so forth. And this is not a new thing in South Africa, of course. Historically, there would be mine workers in South Africa remitting funds back to a Lesotho or an Eswatini, used to be Swaziland, which would be like 30% of their GDP. It's not a small amount of money that was going on. And so those are in terms of remittances, but in terms of where and how, and I also like your point about the how much, because you might be sitting with a fund in Chicago and say, our minimum investment is, $2 million, for example. And a guy sitting in Kigali says, well, we don't know what to do. $2 million is too much for us. We don't actually need $2 million. Is that part of some of what you've seen?
Yes, except and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, like $2 million is a lot of money, especially when you apply it into currency that's not, measured on the same scale. And so I think what often happens is you take the $2 million, but then you can't convert it into real, um, yeah, you can't convert it into cash flow or
Yeah,
profit. And
yeah,
or you make bets that are counterproductive to real profitable.
yeah, yeah. So I love your point about pacing. And then the investing with, the investing for, I mean, investing in Africa can be sort of, I mean, people have done it for centuries, can be sort of extractive in a way. And then the investing for Africa can be philanthropic. And then the investing with Africa, yeah, I like your nuance on that. I think that's that from a positioning perspective. Yeah, that's the idea. So that's fantastic. Great. Okay, good. That was your first point. Anything you wanted to add on that?
No, no,
Yeah,
I found it helpful. Yeah.
good. Fantastic.
Also, I
Great.
would I would also say I find actually I will add one point. I think it can be a bit offensive to people in Africa to hear positioning from a Western investor of saying like, oh, we're going to come and change something or we're going to do something for Africa, like as
Yeah.
subtly implying that they might not be able to do it for themselves. And I found that
Yeah.
not only do Africans not like to be bucketed as Africans, like
Yeah.
they'll describe themselves as Africans as in we're not European or American, but
Mm.
they don't like to be categorized as Africans because there's so many differences, obviously between people, groups, and regions and countries and
Yeah.
It just shows a lack of sensitivity or understanding that the cultures are actually quite different from region to
Yeah.
region, town to town, and circumstance to circumstance. So, um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think the other piece of that is that like the um, the folks on the ground um, don't want to be seen as changed. Like it's like uncomfortable for any human being to have somebody say you're going to change you with money. It's unwanted,
Mm.
and it's misaligned to Christian priorities, I think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
also, it just betrays ignorance right out the gate. And I think a
Right.
better way of framing it is to move Africa. Like,
Yeah.
everyone wants to move forward at their own pace where they want to go at the in the way they want to go. And so for anyone to come alongside anyone and say, hey, we're going to help move you forward. Like, I don't know anyone that would turn that down or feel
Mm.
offended by that and be like, hey, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that
Mm.
interest in where we want to go.
Yeah.
It's usually not the positioning I see. But I
Yeah.
think that subtle change from change or transform Africa or something like that,
Mm.
to move Africa. Like
Mm.
we're here to like be a part of the movement.
Yeah.
Um, I think that is a subtle shift, but a profound and a powerful relational shift. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, historically, I'm young enough to remember when the Sullivan principles were put in place way back in regard to US investments overseas. So US companies pulled out of investing in South Africa because of the apartheid situation. You say, well, that can be a good thing. But there is a bit of a hangover with Western investing when it comes to Africa. And in that it's the philosophy is Africa needs fixing. Versus the Chinese or the some other investors say, well, it's just an opportunity, and others say, the Islamic finance might say, well, it needs guiding. But the US is like, okay, we will give you funding, which comes through programs, which comes with conditions, which comes with reporting and reforms that you have to make. So you're getting money provided you reform. That's why we feel okay about giving you money, because we think that we're making you more Western or something like that. And I presume that you've encountered people who are quite sensitive to that.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. Okay, great. Positioning from in or for Africa to with Africa. What was your next point, John?
So you talk about from a people and people group transformation level to ordered systems thinking and building. And so um, I think two things that I draw out of that. I think one is a lot of people think about, okay, I think it's easy to look at a large continent with infrastructure needs and lagging development in some cases, an investment, and it's easy to say, okay, well, obviously, infrastructure is the thing to do here. But the problem with that is that infrastructure affects like kind of interterritorial or inter-priority issues, and it's not easy to get capital returns
Mm,
on infrastructure level investment. And a lot of investors, when they make bets on things that require infrastructure to mature or to grow or to be dependable, um, they are making, bets on things showing up that there's not necessarily a clear use case
yeah,
for. And so I
yeah,
think those kinds of bets, those infrastructure level bets, like if you have government to government partnerships or industry type partnerships.
yeah,
But I think for single discipline or single business type investors, or to think about systems and how does this business fit within a system, I think is wise and mature thinking to say like,
mm,
well, if the financial services need to grow and we need to be able to move people and goods more dependably or make supply lines more transparent, or the doing business across borders or between rural and urban areas more transparent and more predictable. I think that's an act of generosity on the part of the investor to say, hey, we're not just thinking about the specific business that we're investing in. We're thinking about how it kind of maps up to things that would obviously increase the profitability or the desirability of living in this region or area. And a
Yeah.
lot of the research that I did, kind of, just has been showing the lack of transparency, the lack of consistency in being able to move things and people and money between areas.
Yeah.
And I think that ordered systems thinking,
Mm.
I think places where Christian investors come together, that is what we kind of should be talking about. It's like, okay, what is the focus? Like,
Right.
how do the little things that we're doing map up to the big things that need to happen in these communities? And when we start thinking about infrastructure bets, it's like, okay, well, yeah, does infrastructure need to change? But maybe we're underestimating like the arc in 100 years. But if we think that we're making infrastructure level changes or influencing infrastructure today, we're
Mm.
actually maybe overestimating what we can accomplish with a single investment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And I love your point about people coming together as believers because it's counter behavior in some regards, but it's essential in a place and like a continent like Africa. I think you mentioned multiple points over there. It's not a monolithic thing. I think over 2,000 languages at least. I think they probably keep discovering more dialects and so on. I know when I was in Morocco, they said we had our roots in Africa and our branches in Europe. That's quite different from if you're in another part of the continent and so on. But back to your point about collectively investing in the ordering of systems, the three strands of the gospel as I see it, the ethnos for people, the eschatos for ends of the earth, and the cosmos for the ordered systems. And it's great to invest where somebody else has already built the ordered systems. But when you look at a map of Africa, if you look, for example, at the railroad map of Africa, the railroads, they were just getting stuff from the DRC to the coast, or from upper part of Nigeria down to the coast, or from they weren't an interconnected rail system like you would have in Europe or in the US, for example. I mean, they're extractive, and it's a great visual of some of the disconnects between the countries. The promise is there, but the dots aren't connected, and so being willing to invest in connecting the dots, as you say, an act of generosity, and that somebody else might benefit from you connecting those dots, but it's good for the system as a whole. And I'd love to see some more of that. You were at our place in South Africa last December when we had a group of people thinking about some big projects in Africa. I mean, some of them spanning from Central Africa down to Southern Africa and so forth. And probably as a seasoned entrepreneur, investor, and so on, you probably thought, this is crazy. Some of these guys are thinking about stuff that is so vague and so broad. But in many respects, getting people together like that to think about how their potential things that they're working on can work together as a whole to make a difference. It's a conversation that needs to be had. And I'm wondering whether we shouldn't be having that same conversation in 4 or 5 spots around Africa, going around and having 100 people in each location talking about the combination of investing with Africa and transforming society, and sort of mapping out who's doing what and encouraging them to find each other, co-invest, etc. So yeah, great point like that.
Yeah, I think a complicating factor that I see or have experienced is that there's a lot of people who have ideas, and then there's a lot of people who have capital and are investing things. And the people who have ideas are not very commercially minded, typically. And the people who have, who are investing in real products and services that are, super nitty gritty and kind of hardcore, creating profitability and grinding along, don't really want to sit around and talk about ideas because it's disillusioning, and they've been probably disillusioned along the way of actually making something work. And so it feels inauthentic. But I think if there's a humility and the generosity, I think, to have those conversations both ways, and the patience, I think there is a lot of good that can come from that. But I do think that it's wise to understand the seasonality of ideas and the seasonality of products. And that sometimes an idea takes 100 years to or more to come to bear, and there's a lot of lobbying and different commercial phases that idea might move through to
Yeah.
a lot of recipes involved in kind of creating the banquet, so to speak. Like it just there's a lot of pieces to it, and it takes a lot of patience to see that, and takes a lot of vision and hope in the future, and for people who are different to come together and
Yeah.
talk through those things. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And does it take some educating of if you're a general partner from the US, does it take some educating of your limited partners and your co-investors?
That's a great question. I try to stay away from educating, I think, as a principle, but I would say that I don't have really LPs in that extent, in that way. So I wouldn't know. However, I have been in like on tours with LPs, and I
Yeah.
find that what LPs are looking for is not what investors want to give them. And
Yeah.
so there's a complete mismatch of priorities. Like, for instance, for investors on the ground in Africa deploying funds, they want to deploy funds like VCs employ them in the West Coast. Like, okay, we just set it and forget it. We to build a portfolio of 7 different bets, or 10 or 15 or 25. And then, we just see kind of how they mature.
Yeah.
But that's if they're looking for, charitable aligned capital, or like kind of like this really high impact level capital. People are investing out of foundations, there's granting requirements and all these things, and they're looking for things that are a little bit, maybe have handles on them a little bit more than just, creating a portfolio of good bets. They're looking for more a a a, a stable growth, maybe component, cash flows, buying a piece of cash flows or something with some like resilience. And then also there's making the bets component. But I do think that it works. What from my perspective, the conversations, I don't know if it's a lack of education or just a difference of priority, but there is definitely a disconnect. And I don't know if education is a solution for that, but from my perspective, sometimes I'm in conversations, I'm like, there's just multiple conversations being had here and no one's really listening.
Right. Yeah. So there's a different lens. I like your phrase, set it and forget it. Well, that's not a way to engage with Africa, set it and forget it, because there's so many nuances and stuff changes every week, I would imagine. And plus, it's a different mindset. Yeah. So yeah, really, really like that. Okay. So you talked about the with instead of in or for, talked about the Cosmos investing in audit systems. And I would say that there have been some examples where that's worked in Africa. For example, if you look at the telecom space, where there's been a leapfrogging of the fixed line type of infrastructure. And then there's probably been situations where an existing infrastructure has been neglected. For example, rail systems that were inter-country rail systems, but are now being privatized again, which is, almost a second round investment opportunity, as where some of the governments have failed and private entities are coming in to pick up some of those things. I'm not sure how much you've tracked any of those type of situations. Yeah.
No, not in person. I mean, other than through podcasts and whatnot. And we've looked at a few investments. One of the investments we looked at was kind of a technical infrastructure project that had been, neglected and mismanaged and whatnot. And we ended up passing on it just because there was too many kind of mixed agendas that we couldn't kind of navigate, or didn't feel like we could put handles on to advocate for ourselves as investors. But yeah, the opportunities are real. I think it is really important to find that like right fit where it's like, okay, I think I could actually have some of the conversations here that need to be had, and really dependably look down the road and see like, oh, these interests might need shepherded, or ongoing, personal involvement and attention, but they can be navigated. Where
Yeah.
I think there's some investments that are just too big, the hole's too deep, you can't see the sides of it. And that's
Yeah.
those investments kind of freak me out a little bit because yeah, even though it's technically opportunity, um, it might be opportunity that's mismatched to the scale of what would be needed to actually
Mm.
get to harvest. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the observations around Africa is what you might call spiritual capital, that there's a fair amount of spiritual capital, but you still have mixed agendas, as you say. So if you've got a complex deal and there's 10 players in the thing and somebody wants to sub-optimize player number 7 or player number 3, um, to what extent have you seen people willing to work towards, the ultimate true north aligning principle, which is what is it that gives glory to God, and aligning behind that? Or is that too altruistic, too wishy-washy? To what extent have you seen people say, okay, yeah, I'm willing to take less of a return or a delayed return, provided we're all going after the same thing over here?
I think that almost everyone that I meet is hypothetically willing to do that. And hypothetically willing to push towards that, but almost no one is using the same definition for the glory of God.
Yeah,
And so I think that to say like, oh, well, what would be good for the world and what would glorify God in his intentions for, well-ordered and peaceful and loving society. Um, I I think that's where the breakdown comes.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know when I was writing the Transforming Society book, I was struggling with this question of the glory of God. Like, how do you make it practical for a business guy, for example? Because it's one of those vague religious terms. You ask somebody, what's the purpose of life? Oh, I want to glorify God. Yeah, well, what does that look like if you're doing telecom or if you're doing FMCG or, how do you practically do that if you're, selling shoelaces on the side of the road in Nigeria? And so thinking through what that looks like and translating that, because I've also discovered that you can measure the presence of God. There's things we say, oh, that's just kind of spiritual language, but there are things you can actually put KPIs on some of these things and measure them if you're willing to translate them down into scorecards and get beyond the helicopter view, which is, oh, yeah, we want to see XYZ city. We want to see Rwanda or Kigali or this village transformed in vague terms. I mean, you have to break it down into scorecards for the entities that are going to collectively be part of that, where you can hold feet to the fire. Otherwise, yeah, you're correct. It's just verbal fog.
Yeah, if I could share maybe an opinion on this,
Mm,
yeah, this is an area of passion and actually an interest for me because I find that it's very easy to talk about outcomes of transformation, but that kind of maps back to the first point we started with, where it's very offensive to say, oh, we're going to change you, we're going to change your city, and we're going to change all these things, and it's a kingdom, and people are like, wait, hold on, but we have a president, and we have, these like, real things that we're dealing with, and you're talking in this like kind of vague, flowery, sweeping language that is really about outcomes that are very hard to define, are very hard to point to and be like, oh, it's like this or it's like that. And so I find that, to your point, it is helpful more to focus on the process and the measurable inputs of saying, okay,
mm,
what are we inputting? And as investors, we're looking for investments that increase peace in transactions, in relationships, in increase joy of people using products, joy of access. We're looking for things that increase love and justice and transparency and doing the right thing even for the vulnerable. And we're looking for things that promote righteousness and right living and good quality community and commercial interactions, right?
yeah.
And if we're measuring those four characteristics, right?
Mm,
For every investment, like, is this going to do this? Is this product going to do this? Is it going to create joy for the investor, the
yeah.
stakeholders, the team, the regulators, all that stuff? That's a very different way of investing, and it's actually a very good way of investing. And
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
of the most high quality capital allocators in the world are obsessed with the kingdom of heaven. They just don't know about it. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
literally their framework for investing. They just wouldn't call it the kingdom of heaven. But
yeah,
I think it's very easy to get gummed up in like glory, like the post transformation, like, oh, we want to create this outcome, or we want souls saved, and we want or we want society restored, or we want to prepare people for whatever the Christian outcome is that we're looking for. It's very non-quantifiable and future
yeah,
oriented, and requires
yeah.
us in some cases to be overly pragmatic,
Mm,
impatient, and almost, I would say, reckless maybe with our capital allocation, as opposed to disciplined, measured, patient,
yeah,
collaborative, and unified in our capital
yeah,
allocation, which
yeah,
is a sign of, I think, a real Christian capital allocation is like when there is unity amongst the vendors, the regulators, the team allocating capital,
yeah.
the founders. Like when you see people that are on the same page and they've
Mm,
kind of drawn a circle around
yeah,
priorities that align. And yeah, there might be tension between perspective, there might be tension,
yeah,
information, and all that. But
yeah,
you see that unity, it's like that's a sign of something beyond financial engineering at work. Because engineering doesn't create unity. It might facilitate it, but it might actually bake in counterproductive
mm,
things as well. So yeah, I really like that. Focusing on the inputs and focusing on the
yeah,
measurables as opposed to focusing on outcomes,
yeah,
which are much harder to align on, especially going west to east, because whether you're thinking about going west to east or global north to global south, you know this better than anyone because you basically make that flight multiple times a year and interact with people on both sides of those divides. But um, the how you have the conversation and what the
yeah,
conversation is about and how you interpret, so yeah, spirituality or kingdom or glory or God even as a
yeah,
construct requires so much patience and so much curiosity, and just takes time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I love when the scripture says that the kingdom of God is righteousness, peace, joy in the Holy Spirit, joy in the Holy Ghost, and then adding the love and the unity. And I think your difficulty, as you point out, even like with something like the Sustainable Development Goals, um, when you go into those, you dig into those, and I've done a mapping of the SDGs to foundational principles in scripture, to key scriptures, to critical success factors and so forth. And some of them just fall apart with vagueness. I mean, it's an aspiration. They would like to have something, but they don't really know how to get there. And just it highlights the difficulty of shooting for the stars without saying, okay, well, in order to deal with this, you have to deal with the brokenness in people's lives, or you have to deal with woundedness or forgiveness, or you have to deal with unrighteousness, you have to deal with where there's been a breakdown in peace and so forth. Because otherwise, you've got this thing up there on the wall with nice colors, but you're not dealing with the underlying issues. And we've certainly experienced that in some of the places where we've worked at. Says, well, you can't turn people into entrepreneurs until you've dealt with the trauma in their life. It's just these things go hand in hand, and yeah, so very interesting. I love
Well,
that.
Brett, just to double click on that, because I think this story will probably shock many people who don't live in Africa. It certainly shocks
Yeah.
me when I experienced it. But we are in a slum in Kenya, and it's just shocking. There's sewage, there's kids playing around the sewage, food being cooked, 1 foot from the sewage, and flies in the sewage and on the food, and the kids. And I saw a kid fall into. It's just like it's just kind of really shocking, right?
Yeah.
And you have to walk, all this ways to get water, and it's a water point that you people walk with their jerry cans too, and then they're walking past all the sewage on the way home. It's just crazy. So I'm like assuming in my Western mind, like, okay, the first thing to do here is like water. Like that's the business. Yeah, like clean water, getting rid of the sewage or whatever. And it's so interesting. The smell that as you walk around is so powerful. It's so overcoming. You never forget that smell. But
Yeah.
then I am in an Uber and I recognize the smell. So I guess that the lady driving the Uber is living in this slum, because it's as unmistakably a kind of that mix of burning trash and sewage. And so I started asking her some questions, not obviously assuming in the question that she was some, but I just said, hey, what do you think about your president, how things are going? And she's like, oh, president's corrupt, blah, 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 all that same stuff, right? And I said, well, how's life in this place? How do you see it? And she was like, well, it's actually really good. She's like, it's really good. She was like, they've cleared out the roads, so now the sewage runs in a canal, and it doesn't run on the road, so you can actually walk down the road without walking through sewage. She's like, it's actually really amazing the improvements that the government is making. I was like, yeah, but what about water? I heard they, spent $80 million to get water, and the pipe went in a ditch, and now the ditch is full of sewage, and the pipe is not doing anything except just basically, a paperweight, a very expensive paperweight. And she's like, well, um. She's like, actually, she's like, it's really amazing because you only have to walk a half a kilometer or 1 kilometer at the most for water. She's like, so they've set up a water point so that you don't have to walk any further than that. So no matter where you are in the community, and I thought that's so fascinating. Like for her, the state of things is a tremendous improvement relative to what she expected. And actually, this was kind of agreed on, or corroborated by a question I heard a very smart lady ask a local guy who was, ran a spice trading business and also was very involved in the community and ran an after school program for kids. And she said, hey, if somebody made you the mayor of this slum, which I think there's about 1 million people or maybe 500,000 people
Yeah.
living in this, and just kind of from a Western perspective, appalling condition, but not appalling in the sense that people are happy, and they're doing their thing. But she asked if somebody made you the mayor of this, what would be the first thing you do? Like water, sewer, like what do you think? He's like, no, 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 none of that. First thing, shut down the churches because they're basically dens of thieves, and they're deceiving people and telling them not to go to work, not to send their kids to school, but to come to the church and pray and give them money, and they'll pray for a miracle. And so people are kind of being paralyzed. And he's like, the second thing is the healthcare. There's so many health issues, and they derail employment when they do find a job, and then they can't get that job back. And so he's like getting like kind of like urgent care type health, very proximate to where people are living. And I thought that's so interesting. That's not the two things I would have started with as a Western investor. I would have tried
Yeah.
to turn it into a Western city from that perspective,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
really thought about what are the core drivers of some of these issues.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a lot of what is creating peace and love and joy for the people there might be
Yeah.
what's different than for the Western investor. And a lot of
Yeah.
times we haven't really self-identified our own guilt or our own gratitude. We're not like really living in our gratitude as investors, and we haven't self-identified our feeling of guilt when we walk into a situation like that and be like, hold on, I live like this, and I didn't necessarily choose to be born in Pennsylvania. And they're living like this, and it's harder, and they live closer to so many things that are difficult, and hard, difficult lives. Like and when we can't separate that from the capital allocation decisions, and we can't like, kind of move that to the left side of our brain and say like, hey, yeah, that is really hard, but like, let's not make a decision based on that. Like, let's go in and like ask and like really seek and
Yeah.
discover what are the priorities and what's going to create peace and joy, and restoration on the ground in the eyes of the people who actually live there and need it and need to own it going forward
Yeah.
to be successful.
Mm. That's a really, really good point and quite a powerful illustration. In terms of really understanding what's going on, I remember having a conversation with the governor of Casablanca at the time, I was in there doing some lemon leadership and other work with him. And there's a problem with trash in the city. And so, yeah, he's educated in Canada or somewhere like that. He's lived overseas. And so he has a bit of the Western mindset, but he was really, really smart. So instead of saying, oh, we're going to have a government program to pick up trash or whatever, he sent his people in to follow the people who were actually picking up trash and doing things. And he found out there was a whole system. There were people picking up plastic on the thing. Then they were taking it to a location and they were getting paid, and there were sorters and there were this and there were that. And, he understood the system before he started messing with it. Same thing with street vendors. You see somebody selling, I don't know, shoe polish or toothpaste or something on a mat on the sidewalk. And he found out that the restaurant or the store rented that sidewalk space to the person doing that. And so he found out the whole ecosystem and what was going on. And then he set up a market like in the town with booths, with numbers, with security and so forth, so that the sidewalk mafia type of situation was broken. But he first understood what was actually going on, rather than passing a law that said you can't have sidewalk vendors or whatever it might have been. And so I like your point about really understanding what's going on and getting the sense of priority of what the people really, really need and want and what changes their lives and so forth. Yeah, very, very good. Okay, so we've talked about the within four. We've talked about investing in Cosmos infrastructure. Hard to get people, but there is a need for almost a fund of funds or a collective view if you're going to solve multiple things along the supply chain, because if anything breaks on that supply chain, your individual investment somewhere there is in jeopardy. We've talked about righteousness, peace, joy, love, unity, focusing on inputs rather than something that's vague and obtuse, but focusing on inputs. What else was on your mind as you went through the book, John?
One thing that I found really helpful was a focus on self-identification. I think that there seems to me to be two types of capital going into Africa. One type is pre-risk capital, where it really needs to make a return for the investor, because if it doesn't make a return for the investor, they can't continue doing what they do for a living. And I would say that there's stakes to investing that kind of capital. And you have to make good decisions, and you have to be aware of that, and you have to call that out. And I think that some people who are placing capital in Africa on the ground underestimate, maybe it's easy to not sympathize with the LPs that they're investing for, to say like, oh no, but this diminishes their reputation, or it might diminish their if we don't return capital. And so just to be transparent about, is this pre-risk capital or the other kind, which is I think post-risk, which is it's made its return. This is money that's meant to be on a one-way train if needed. Obviously nobody hopes that the capital doesn't return, but like, understanding that like this is for the purpose of standing in the gap, or seeding something that needs to be seeded, or bringing something into existence that needs to exist, whether or not it's economically profitable. And I think that just having language and handles around that conversation is really helpful. But I think self-identifying is the most important part of that, saying, what are my constraints? What type of investor am I? And what type of region am I planning on putting capital into even? I love the, way you kind of break it down to conflict or opportunity or, stability. Like, it is really different in deploying capital. It doesn't, no system can perfectly map a situation. As you are well aware, and that's not your intention, but you are giving some kind of basic frameworks of saying, here's what you need to be aware of, or some places are less stable than others, and some regions have different dynamics. So,
yeah, very, very good. Yeah, the thinking about the zones and the level of trust and diversity. And so which zone you're going into, and then how do you mitigate? So you might say, well, Nigeria is the Wild West, yeah, but it also has like 50% of Africa's entrepreneurs, for example. So how do you mitigate some of the uncertainty, the risk, and so forth? Well, do you mitigate them with trusted faith networks? Then how do you separate out Christian from kingdom? Because you've got, I'd love to go back to your point about the guy recommending that one closes the churches, because this is a dilemma in Africa, because there's a lot of religious language around things. So if somebody's coming in as a Western investor, I mean, an African can give you like 200 recited Bible verses and tell you all sorts of stuff like that, but they might not be living out the kingdom in the way that you would expect. So you have to be able to separate out the language from the reality. And if you're going to use a faith network as a mitigator of some of the diversity, the uncertainty, the trust factors, and so forth. And so, yeah. So, okay. So, but your point was figure out, identify what kind of capital you have, pre-risk, post-risk, what your time horizons are. Are you willing to put your capital on a one-way train, or even though you're hoping that there's a return on that, and so it's going to be an ongoing round trip, is what you're hoping for, but you self-identify with that and be realistic about that is what you say. Yeah.
Yeah, and that can even be a process because sometimes it's hard to identify what risk looks like on another continent than the one you live in or were born on. And at least I find that for myself is sometimes it's hard to know exactly to what proportion. It's okay. So if this is a sound capital allocation in Pennsylvania, is it a sound capital allocation in Africa for me?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard. It takes, and I think there's a lack of patience. There's a built up or like a pent up bitterness almost towards Western investors. I find that there's not a lot that kind of like breaks that down into really constructive conversation. And that's something that I would love to figure out. And I think your book does do that. I think it's very gracious towards Western investors. I don't find it to be tinged with bitterness or frustration. And I do find a lot of resources like, well, you have money and we need money. Like, yeah, but that's a spirit of selfish ambition and envy. Like, we need to not think about it in terms of envy, but we also need to not think about it in terms of selfishness. Like, we need to think of it in terms of being generous and putting, re-risking, as Praxis talks about, which I love. And then also understanding that like this is the stewardship of the investor and they need to do a good job, and we need to enable them by doing a job by self-identifying ourselves as an investment and then even sometimes as people placing capital on the continent, we can then help LPs or investors that are looking to place capital on the continent self-identify and say, well, here's decisions that would be very aligned with the type of return and the type of thing that you need to do. So
in the book of Acts, with Ananias and Sapphira, our real estate friends, there's a very interesting principle over there, because the apostles said to them, look, before you sold the land was yours. After you sold the land, the money was yours. And there's an interesting thing over there. Between Ananias and Sapphira, everything was God's, and between the people involved, it's like, that is your capital, that is your land, that's yours. I'm not entitled to that. And it's very easy if you foster a victim mentality, and this can happen within a country, it can happen in the US, can say, oh, John's a gazillionaire and I'm not there for him. I'm entitled to John's stuff. No, you're not. Between me and John, it's all God's, right? Between John and God, that's for him to figure out. And I'm not entitled to his capital. I'm not entitled to Western capital, and so forth. And so one has to have a posture of humility on both sides. And mistakenly, perhaps, when we started doing work extensively in Africa, we did not lead with capital because we just thought it's going to pull people out of the woodwork who are thinking, here are Westerners, people coming in from Silicon Valley, they have money, therefore I want to get close to them. We didn't. So we said we know we're not going to bring that kind of capital. Now, probably we should have had some investment thing alongside what we were doing, but um, figuring out some of that and getting rid of the entitlement mindset is really, really important. And yeah, this is a mutual stewardship. If you're going to invest with Africa, then you have to have a mutual stewardship of everything that God has provided and value the capital investor as much as you value a spiritual investor in intellectual property, a sweat equity investor, local relationships, customs, etc., and not, yeah, yeah. So I think it's a really, really important part. Yeah, good. So it's a hard job being an investor, right?
Yeah. I suppose, yeah, not as hard as building something. Yeah. I think it's a harder job to be a founder or
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. You've done both. Yeah, yeah. Good. Okay, John, what's next on your list?
So I think that, and I think this goes for every Christian, but I think specifically with investors, and I think maybe even foremost with investors, is we don't like to see ourselves as societal transformers. And I think that is something you point out in your book is to say, hey, well, everything you do is transforming society on some level. The question is in what direction?
Yeah,
Um, and I think that, and this goes back to your point about the glory of God. It is very easy to think about the glory of God as in something we give to God, but actually, John also talks about it in terms of something that God gives to us. And John 17 says, the glory you have given me, I've given to them, that
yeah,
they may be one, even as we are one, I and them, and you and me, that they may become perfectly one. So the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you loved me. And I think that
yeah.
it's hard sometimes as investors to think about that word. That's like talking about us, and it's talking about capital investment
Mm,
and capital allocation. And how can we embody that? And so to see ourselves, to say that no, God is bestowing his glory on us, and whatever we're carrying our presence into, whatever we're allocating capital into, whatever we are envisioning or influencing performance or influencing how decisions are made with capital, we are actually carrying the glory of God, the presence of Christ into those
mm.
situations. And I think to embody the glory and to understand like that's a commission, and it's very easy to underestimate the commission and overestimate the mission. Meaning,
Yeah,
it's very easy to overestimate how effective we're going to be in terms of transformation and underestimate the commission in terms of authority that we need to embody. And I think we should, as Christian capital allocators, kind of reverse that and say, the commission is to actually steward the presence of Christ. Like that's the highest commission that we can have
yeah,
is to
yeah,
bring in love and seeing and protecting and healing and restoration into what we're trying to do. And not to underestimate our commission, but to actually intentionally downgrade our mission, intentionally underestimate the mission. Be like, we don't know how effective this is going to be. We don't actually know if we're even betting on the right horse here, so to speak, or even really seeing the situation fully or completely. And so we don't know if there's going to be transformation,
mm,
or if the thing that we think is going to be good is actually going to be a pretty big disaster.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
we are going in with a sense of um, going in with a sense of our commission and a sense
yeah,
of the glory of Christ and the fact that he has called us and commissioned us to be his hands and feet wherever
mm,
we walk, and that where
mm.
we walk is the presence of Christ. The presence of Christ is going. And I think to me, if investors see themselves like that, it kind of transforms the exercise a little bit. And it allows us to diverge a little bit from the kind of maybe some industry norms and actually um, look for more creative, more aligned, more um, personally and situationally appropriate ways of doing
Yeah,
things that um, might not feel exactly right because we're not getting the social validation, we're not getting the industry
yeah,
validation. So this is how capital should be deployed. And it's so interesting. Some of I feel like my most effective capital deployments have been the most untraditional and the ones that have agonized over the most. I'm like, this isn't how it's done. Like, this is too little money. But I can't figure out how to invest more money to make this change. But just going with it because it's what the situation required, and then turning out to be very effective. Like years and years later,
Yeah.
like, okay, that's why that was effective. Yeah, it's easy to look back.
Okay.
So,
Well, I love your point about being counterintuitive, being led by God, do stuff. But as you've often heard me say, capital always carries an agenda. If capital is carrying the glory of God, it will override another agenda. Otherwise, it's too dangerous in many respects because large capital allocations, any capital allocations often go with control and go with the agenda of the world. The term sheets, etc., are geared towards control, accountability, checklists, all of that kind of stuff. And it's so easy for that to be like Velcro, where control and other things stick to it, versus, okay, the intention of the deployment of capital is to carry the glory of God into a situation. I love that. I think it's a good counter to the negative agendas of capital, even from Christians, because that's the way business is done, or that's the way investing is done, or that's just the way term sheets are written or deals are structured, versus, is this carrying the glory of God? And I was struggling with this question of the glory of God back in 2010 when I was first writing the Transforming Society book. And I had a dream, John. I don't know if I shared it with you, but I saw these people walking along like a dusty roads. Looked like it was India or somewhere like that, based on the way people were walking. And the people, there were these giant floating eggs, almost like ostrich eggs, but white glowing eggs. And I knew it was the glory of God. And they were floating along, and some people didn't even see it. Some people didn't see them. It was there. And others saw them and freaked out and like backed away from the glory of God. And others saw it and carried it in the sense that it moved with them. And I became aware that it was more important to be carrying the glory of God than to know where you were going. And I think from an investment perspective, it's more important, like, is this investment furthering the glory of God? Versus like, where's this thing going to end up 3-5 years from now, for example? And then the other thing I saw was that, of course, products can carry the glory of God, as I was just waking up from that. But the other thing was, I saw in the dream, sometimes that shiny egg thing was covered in like soot and black mist and so on. And that happened when people were criticizing each other, and Christians in particular. So when you go back to your John 17, praying for unity, for love, that we would know the love of God, that we would be one, and thereby reveal God's glory. Carrying God's glory means also not criticizing. It's easy to point fingers at somebody else, what they're doing, how they're investing, how they're doing their business, the corruption in their country, or the lack of sanitation, whatever the situation might be. It's easy to criticize, and criticism clouds the glory of God. And so, yeah, it helped me understand and unpack the glory of God. And in fact, I recognized also that one of the reasons why people don't get along, and in some respects why we have challenges in people connecting with each other, is because people are digging for dirt instead of looking for gold. They're not looking for glory. And so when I meet somebody, I say, okay, is this operator, this business owner, the real deal? Do they have this? What's their family life like? Do they have the proper education? All this kind of stuff. And I'm just looking for reasons. I'm not looking for glory. I'm not saying, okay, so how does this person reflect the glory of God in a way that I've not seen before? And this applies to my wife. We've been married for a long time. Lynn and I started dating in 1975, so it's a long time ago. And but waking up with the expectation, like, I could see something of the glory of God in Lynn that I've never seen before, changes my whole perspective as to how. So, I know John. I've known John for a while, but I could see something of the glory of God if I look in John today that I've never seen before. It changes the way I relate to you. And I love the way that you've rolled that into the world of investing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that shift to curiosity about each other as opposed to criticism, I think is really powerful. And I think it's really powerful, especially for Westerners going east. And I think when we go and yeah, things might operate a certain way, but when we have curiosity and openness um, about our neighbors, our counterparts on the continent, I think it can be really actually very fun and it takes the pressure off because rather than having to come up with a position on everyone that we might invest in or everyone we might want to work with, we can come up with a list of questions to ask them and understand kind of where they're coming from and how they think. And I found that I've learned a tremendous amount and been just I feel like my courage and my person, my humanity has increased um, tremendously by working with my African counterparts and
Yeah.
learning from them. So
So give us your top takeaways of your year or so in Africa. What are some of the things as you've looked at it? I mean, when you're there on the ground, you're more immersed than just popping in for a 1 week investment tour.
yeah, so I my top takeaways are that I actually don't know that I could do that, to be
Mm,
honest with you. I don't know that I'm far enough from the even just like the past year. I think that I have learned a lot, met incredible people, and seen things worked very differently than I would have suspected.
mm,
And even originally assumed like walking in and seeing at first. So yeah, I learned a lot. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so tell me a bit then about the how have you been enriched by your time in Africa?
I would say that humbled.
Mm,
I have been friendship, made friends, seen dimensions of how things work that I wouldn't have seen in the West.
mm,
Um, and I've been humbled by just the work ethic and commitment and people's generosity towards each other in a way that I didn't know was possible or didn't have a frame of reference for before. And so I think walking um, away with that frame of reference has been really, really powerful and beautiful and um, yeah, humbling.
mhm. Fantastic, fantastic. John, any other closing thoughts on the Investing with Africa side of things? Thanks again for your review and support and for your perspectives. Do you have any other closing thoughts as you head off? I know you've got a meeting coming up.
Yeah. I don't know that I have any closing thoughts or any particular opinions or like amazing bullets to share. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
I think that if you have an opportunity, if any Western investor has an opportunity to partner with capital allocators on the continent that are curious and that are community minded and that are looking for kingdom outcomes of love, joy, peace,
Mm,
righteousness, I would say Susanna said something to me the other day, like about the humanity, like your humanity
mm,
increases the closer you get to people in Africa. And I think there is something that I feel my spirit resonates with that the more that
yeah,
I spend time with Africans, I feel like I learn how to be a better human.
yeah,
And I would recommend and commend that
yeah.
um, to um, to anybody
Mm,
to spend time and to learn and to enjoy the
mm,
tremendous depth of personality and character that you will encounter in people
mm.
without the rush and the agenda
Mm.
necessarily that you encounter in the
Yeah,
West.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Fantastic. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your friendship so much. Greatly appreciate the conversation.
Thank you, Brett. Great to be with you. Have a good day.